So session 2 started off with a little bit of overworld travel leading into a wildly unsuccessful combat encounter. Like, this combat encounter made me feel super incompetent as a DM because it was very incompetently done. In the first place, they shouldn't have been doing this combat encounter. They were there was a series of combat encounters that I kind of planned out, just like, very simple. I had all these stat blocks, so I'm like just kind of dropping them in, saying there's this many of this kind of creature and stuff. And I had a big variety of creatures because I've been working on stat blocks like crazy, just like making all these like custom goblins and variants and stuff like that, which has been a lot of fun. So I was so excited to throw them at my players, but I should have held back a little bit more, maybe given them some, like, maybe a group of like 4 normal goblins, like just a little combat encounter that they could actually get through. And it was so stupid of me because after I had made my little like D8 roll chart to determine, like, okay, if they have a random like patrol encounter just against a goblin patrol in this area, these are the like possible encounters they would fight. After I made that chart, I looked at it and I realized, like, these are all pretty strong. They won't be able to handle these fights until they're like 2nd, 3rd level maybe. Definitely not for 1st level, which they still are after the first session. They only had that one combat encounter, so they're like fairly close. Maybe they were maybe about halfway to 2nd level at the beginning of the session, but they were still at 1st level. They shouldn't have been fighting these like groups that I had planned out. But I don't know what it was. Maybe I was just so gung-ho to like show them some of these monsters that I had cooked up that I just kind of was like, they'll be fine. We'll do it. Like, players just have kind of a way of finding their way out of like imbalanced situations, I mean, not every combat encounter has to be perfectly like equal in terms of like hit point count, possible damage output and stuff like that, because players can pull out a lot of tricks and figure stuff out. So I'm just like, whatever. I like cut one of the goblins that was gonna be in there, but the group was still outnumbered, which was that was a big red flag, because being outnumbered is just dangerous. Even if the creatures aren't particularly difficult, it is still dangerous for the players to be outnumbered. And part of that was because we were down 1 player that day. Usually I have a party of 5, but we were down to 4 on that night. And I was just like, I looked at the encounter and I like rolled it and I looked at it and I was just like, okay, I'll like cut this goblin and then like we'll be fine. Which was, it was very foolish. It was very incompetent on my part. I didn't give it a lot of thought. But they ended up having this encounter, which went like this. They were at a river crossing, and 2 of them were partway through the river in like difficult terrain, and 2 were waiting on the bank and they were about to cross as well. And then this goblin patrol comes up to attack them, and that gave it a little bit of like extra, terrain difficulty and stuff like that, just to kind of like shake things up. And they just started getting trounced. I did get to use my hobgoblin. I think that was one of like the reasons I was so gung-ho about it, is because the encounter that I rolled had a hobgoblin in it, and I was like way excited to see how this thing was going to go, because I had put a lot of thought into how it was going to work. It was a pretty cool stat block that I had been working on. So I think me just like being over eager and just jumping the gun, just like wanted to use this creature. And because of the way, I made the hobgoblin to be specifically like a platoon leader, I wanted him to have, like a good sized little group with him. So I very foolishly just like barely nerfed the encounter by cutting 1 goblin and just like went for it, which was so stupid. It was so stupid. And my players knew pretty quickly that it was an imbalanced encounter, that it was not fair at all, and they didn't get like upset about that necessarily, or at least they didn't express that they were like upset about it in the moment. But it did mean that they like quickly recognized that they needed to get out of there rather than trying to win this fight, which was good. I'm glad that my players are the kind of players who don't feel like they're locked into every fight, and they decided to get the heck out of there. And I'm glad they did that because the fight was totally unfair. It was like super imbalanced. Even so, we noticed a couple of problems with on the party side as well that were making things imbalanced in their favor. One of them was that our sorcerer, when he did his first level features and stuff, you're supposed to do your maximum hit die value plus your Constitution modifier for the first level, and he added his Constitution score, so he was at like 21 hit points, I think, at this encounter, and we just didn't notice it. I don't know if he took any hits during the first combat encounter, so we didn't notice it. And that was super overpowered, and he should not have been at 21 HP as a sorcerer at the first level. And my friend who was playing the dancer custom like homebrew class that I was trying out, he misunderstood his ability. He was using one of his dance flares every single turn to heal everyone for their hit die. They just roll their hit die, and then he heals them for that much, and then he gains that much health that he healed from other people as temporary HP. And he was doing this like every turn, and as far as he could tell, he was just stacking up temporary HP just for the whole combat encounter. And I was sitting there like, I don't know if that's supposed to be how that works, because if it is, I kind of regret buying this class. Then when we did take a break after the combat, I went and read it more closely to like see how the flares worked and how this particular flare worked. And what he was supposed to do is when he wants to use this flare, he spends his hit die to use this ability, and then the person that he's healing spends their hit die. So that's a big difference. Spending your hit die versus just healing for the hit die amount that's a huge jump in power. So I explained this to him, and that like, yeah, you basically just have like, you get one more hit die every level, so basically that means you get to use it one more time every level. But he was just using like every single action, and that was awful, because it meant that like at the end of the combat encounter, they realized that like, the sorcerer was like, okay, if I didn't have that like incorrect amount of HP, and if he wasn't using that dance ability like over and over again every turn, we totally would have lost that. We would have died. And I think my whole party was like convinced that that's how it would have gone down, which is the worst thing that can happen when they realize that like, oh, we should have died because like we were doing mechanically stuff wrong. It like totally breaks verisimilitude, and they're just like, okay, this wasn't real, like we should have been dead. And also our DM didn't like bother to balance the encounter or whatever. So the whole thing just felt like a huge failure. I had thought about it after the fact, and I was like, well, maybe there's like some like positives to it, because I did want them to like learn that the goblins actually can be a threat and they're not just like goobers. And in particular, I wanted to introduce this like hobgoblin creature that I had made, and have them sort of like fear it, like take the hobgoblin very seriously, as like, okay, when one of these dudes show up, it's like scary, right? Because he kind of showed off during the battle that he can basically do like, he can order the goblins to do like stance changes, like they can just change their stance to an attack stance where they get an extra d4 on their damage roll, or he can have them like move their movement speed, which I thought was like weird, that you could like somehow make people move faster or like do like that much more, because the round is supposed to be like a certain amount of time or whatever. And I was like, it doesn't really make sense that he would just be able to issue an order and suddenly have people just like move at like lightning speed. Even though that's not like really the idea behind that. The idea behind it is like tactician and like moving creatures around the battlefield. I thought it didn't make sense to be able to do that in like a turn, but other creatures in like the monster manual and other products I had seen had like similar abilities. So it's just like, whatever, I'll just do it. It was cool. So I wanted them to fear this hobgoblin. I wanted him to do his like, oh, I'll talk about that in a minute. I wanted him to fear the hobgoblin, have him do all this stuff, but then after thinking about it more and realized after I was thinking like, oh, they kind of like are afraid of this hobgoblin now, so maybe that's like a cool thing. I also realized that like they were a little bit more afraid of just the MCDM snipers, the ones that they had already fought, because they just do so much damage. They just do a lot of damage, and they were standing far away, and just as artillery guys, they were just kicking butt, especially because, you know, half my party was stuck in a river, not able to move. So I didn't even get to accomplish like hyping up this like cool bad guy that I had made up. It did a little bit. They saw, I think at the end they sort of saw this particular hobgoblin as maybe like a potential rival. Maybe somebody could come back, and I think that was like a cool idea. They like kind of alluded to the Shadow of Mordor like rivalry system that they have in there, or like Nemesis, I think it's called, where you know, you will just be like randomly fighting some orcs, and then you see that like across the battlefield this one guy that killed you before, like he survived a fight with you, and he got ranked up in the goblin like hierarchy or whatever, which is a super cool system. And I was trying to sort of like do like a lightweight version of that in this campaign. So it's kind of a cool idea. I think I'm going to take what my players like sort of threw out there, maybe as a joke, and try to expand on it so that, you know, maybe that particular hobgoblin that kicked their butt will come back and make like a new appearance at an appropriate level this time. But yeah, I think it did like kill the excitement for the session a little bit after that. I did want to throw like 2-3 combat encounters at them, and it just ended up being that one, and I was like a little bit timid to try to do another one that night. But there were some other cooler things that happened after that. But yeah, just in general, the hobgoblin character, I mean, I was happy with how he worked. It was like a good proof of concept for this stat block and how he was able to actually like effectively like you know, make an impact on the battle, even by like just issuing these like commands. And when I was deciding him, I tried to think of like what would be like a goblin tactician, not just any tactician, but how do goblins operate in this way? And for him, I was like, okay, he has like 2 special moves that just show off like how a goblin tactician would work. One of them is Goblin Throw, where he just picks up a goblin that's nearby and just hucks it forward, and it counts as a ranged attack. And then if that goblin, when it lands, you know, makes a dexterity save, then he can then do an attack when he lands, which is really cool. He got to do that, but the goblin didn't attack, and he didn't hit the ranged attack, which was good because a player would have died probably. And then the other move that he can do, which I didn't get a chance to show off, is a Goblin Shield, which is where if the hobgoblin's going to get hit by something, then he uses his reaction to pick up a goblin and just hold it in front of him to block the hit, and the goblin will instantly die. It basically expends the goblin, which I thought was so fun. He didn't get to use it this time, though. That'll be a move that they learn about later. And yeah, so they got across the river. They decided to retreat from this combat, and I kind of tried to play it off as if that was the thing they were supposed to do by saying that, like, yeah, the goblins kind of like, once you get past the tree line, they kind of look into the forest and they're just like, no, we don't really want to go there. And they kind of like turn back and start walking the other way. Kind of implying that like, okay, you're getting away from this fight, but the thing that you're getting yourself into next is going to be like so much sketchier that like the goblins are just, they're like, they're going to die anyway. Just like let the forest goblins have it or whatever. Which maybe the players saw right through that and they're just like, yeah, this is just William like going easy on us so we don't die. But I think at this level of the campaign, that's probably acceptable. They're probably fine with that. But moving on from that, that was like probably the biggest takeaway from the session was just that horrible combat encounter. But there was more things that happened. They went into the forest, and the forest is like a cool place where I have a lot of like, it's probably the most mystical faction of the goblins live in that part of the Ache. There are some goblin magicians and stuff, and a lot of the encounters, like random encounters that I planned for the forest, are non-combat encounters. Like I wanted them to run into a lot of like goblin-y weirdness in this forest, and not just have it be like, you know, fighting on an open field. Okay, for me that's not like what goblins are all about. You want to have non-combat encounters with them as well, because they're just so weird and chaotic, right? So a couple encounters that they did have, one, they took a long rest, and during the course of that long rest they started being haunted by the boggarts. And as I mentioned before, boggarts will slowly drain the AC of the player characters until they die, or until they, you know, are detected. So every hour that they're haunting the players, their AC is going down. And I described this to them by saying, like, you kind of feel off, you're like feeling a little clumsy, your like vision's going a little weird, like, and then just also like flat out telling them like, hey, your AC is lowered right now, which should have put them more like on guard. But I think at the beginning of the next session, that's like one thing I'm going to emphasize, because I have been keeping notes on where their AC's at. And I think one of the things I'm going to do early on in the next session is just say, okay, here's where all of your AC is at right now. And they'll be like, wait, what? And then they'll start investigating the forest. And I think the combat encounter with the boggarts won't be too difficult. I don't think it'll just like kill them. It's just, it'll be scary, I think, because they're gonna get hit like almost every time because their AC is so low. I think that is going to be the major threat. They had a non-combat encounter where they were in the forest and ran into some goblins who were preparing a big bonfire, and this was led by a goblin magic user, and one of my players actually used the magical tooth that they were given, my lore delivery device, which is good. It means they remembered they had that and they're actually using it to learn that, you know, a goblin may develop a little bit of magical aptitude and learn and prepare one spell. So they know now that if they go and fight some goblin magic users, they're expecting them to have one spell that they use, and then they're out, and then they can do some other tricks, but they're not like spells. Okay. So they get to, it was a non-combat encounter. They just hung out with these goblins for a little bit, and one of my players had this idea to challenge them to a limbo competition. It's like, hey, these guys are just prepping for a party. Let's just have like a little bit of fun with them. And it just became like a dexterity check contest thing. And at the end, the goblin magic user promised to furnish them with some maracas just like they have. And the maracas are a weapon that have a chance to induce exhaustion, which is fun. I don't know how that works with against monsters. I might change the mechanics a little bit for the version that the players get. But the goblins version, it causes exhaustions. But that's what they wanted. My players were interested in like procuring some maracas like this, just because it seemed like a fun thing that the goblin had. So I'm gonna see what I can do with that. They're wanting to go check out Scrimbly's Hollow, so they went over there towards that town, and on the way they ran into what's his name? Gungo, the goblin merchant. Now Gungo, I think, is going to be an important character because you want a goblin who is just straight up friendly. Like the goblins at the bonfire were friendly, but they weren't going to be super useful. Gungo is friendly and useful. So he is a merchant, and he will actually accept their gold and sell them stuff. And he also is a information, expository kind of guy. he'll basically like start telling them what the current status is with the Brouhaha, what he knows about it, and he is a goblin who's more friendly with humans because he has this like system where he sells them stuff and like does trading and stuff like that with them. And designing his store was kind of fun. I got to think about like, okay, this goblin has a little store just in the hollow of a tree, and he just kind of sticks out and he's like, hey, you want to buy some stuff? And I got to think of like all this like weird stuff that he might have in his shop. Some of it was like pretty mundane. Like he did have a couple of like crappy weapons and stuff like that they would be looking for. But he also had stuff like a scented candle that was in the carcass of a dead bird. I guess it wouldn't be a carcass of an alive bird. You wouldn't say it like that. But yeah, it was a carcass of a bird, and what else did they buy? You know, there was like a set of marbles there that they could buy. There was an unidentifiable object, and when I say unidentifiable, I don't mean that it's just not identified. I mean, they cannot tell what it is. Like they can sell it. It's like roughly like this size. They can sort of tell the color. But I have no idea what this thing is. Like they cannot say for the life of them what it is or what its purpose is. I just threw that in there and they wanted to buy it. And a literal CD, like a compact disc, was another item that he had in there. I didn't tell him that. I just described it as like it's a flat, circular object. It's very shiny on one side. It has a hole in the middle. On the other side, it has a picture on it. And they purchased that having no idea what it was. They didn't even like put together that it was a CD. And hopefully they'll get into that more later. But yeah, that's Gungo, and if they talk to him more, they are going to, you know, try to find out like where the Brouhaha's at as far as like the preparations for the event, and also maybe something about the character himself. One thing that I want to do is I want to use these next couple of sessions to kind of sprinkle in some of the other possibilities of what they might do to resolve this campaign. None of my player characters are humans, so I'm going to have Gungo question them on like, why are you out here? And when they say trying to stop the Goblin Brouhaha, he's going to be like, why? You guys are not humans. What stake do you have in this? You know, not put like eloquently like that, but basically just point out like, I'm pretty sure you guys aren't humans, right? Like you're not. Like I can't really tell the difference all the time, but why do you care if we do this? And that will make them actually have to come up with an answer. And I think they have thought about this a little bit. Like some of their characters seem to have like a personal thing against goblins or something from what they've described. But I want to just like plant the idea like, hey, like at least think a little bit more about how you want to accomplish this. I think when they get to Mama Scrimbly, one of the ideas that I'll try to plant in their head is like, there are some goblins who are not happy with how this is going, and maybe that can lead them in a different direction. One thing that my players have said, and I think this is one of the things that I am competent with as a DM, is listening to my players and trying to implement what they give me in like a satisfying way, you know, and not just like ignore stuff and like do what I want to do. So maybe mechanically I still have a lot to work on, but with this kind of thing, I noticed that my players, they're still carrying Goblin around. And one thing that they've said a couple of times, they're kind of speculating right now that Goblin is Brouhaha. They're like, this is him. He's just gonna turn out to like be the guy at the end, and we know that's not true because we know that he's just a random goblin I threw in because I'm like, I wanted to just fill the air for a second in the first session, but it's a fun idea, and it relates to another idea I had. So he is one of Mama Scrimbly's kids. That's why he's from Scrimbly's Hollow. That's why they're going there first, is because they met Goblin, and he mentioned, I'm from Scrimbly's Hollow, so like, let's go there. They didn't, I mean, it's good a reason as any. If you have a whole map in front of you, might as well go to this place first. It's pretty close to the entrance, right? So they are taking Goblin, and what I want to do is I want to have Mama Scrimbley be a little bit sour, or maybe have a rumor that she's pretty upset that like the Brouhaha was not one of her own children. Like she's maybe one of the oldest, or maybe the mama, the Goblin mama that has the most children, or something like that. So she feels like she should be the one that gave birth to Brouhaha, and she wasn't. And I sort of want to try to lead my players in this direction of, hey, if you can just decide to like use Boblin and just like start calling him Brouhaha, and like go around to various parts of the egg trying to convince goblins that he's Brouhaha, and that'll basically just make a schism in like the goblin society, and they'll start like fighting amongst themselves. I really like this idea because I've already set it up in the lore that like Brouhaha is a name that goblins don't just give to their kids. There's like this weird like innate like instinct that they have where they give birth to a kid and they're like, okay, this one's called Brouhaha. They just like know that naturally. It's just a funny little piece of lore I put in there, but it also means that they've never had two people named Brouhaha before. That this conflict of like, wait, which Brouhaha are we supposed to follow? There's like a false one. That's never come up before. So if they're clever enough, or they pay enough attention and think about the lore enough, then they'll be able to follow this totally different avenue of like, okay, instead of just going around and like killing the little bosses of the goblins and stuff like that, we're going to try to create a rift and have goblins turn on each other, and that will be the device we use to actually go like defeat the real Brouhaha. That's like a cool idea that I'm going to try to use what they've given me in order to sort of open that up as a possibility. We'll see how it goes. So this session was not super happy with it, and I think my players kind of like lost excitement for it after the beginning of it went so bad, but I'm going to try to, you know, just get back on, pick it up, give them like a cool but easier encounter that they can use to get to level 2, because they really need to level up. And yeah, it'll be a lot better.